carriage wheels stopped grinding against gravel, and Alara Whitfield's heart stopped with them. She looked out the window at the gray stone walls of Blackmore, and knew, without being told, that something was wrong. The estate looked abandoned. Ivy choked the windows. No smoke rose from the chimneys, and the man beside her, the man she had married only 7 days ago, was already reaching for the door handle before the wheels had fully settled. "Alaric," she said, her voice small in the cold air of the carriage, "why have we stopped here? I thought we were going to your townhouse in the city." Duke Alaric Thorne did not look at her. He straightened his coat, adjusted the signet ring on his finger, and spoke as though he were dismissing a servant rather than addressing his wife. "This is where you will stay. I have business in the capital that cannot wait. You will be looked after." Alara felt the blood drain from her face. Looked after by whom? There is no smoke from the chimneys. There are no lights in the windows. "Alaric, please, look at me when you speak." But he did not look at her. He stepped down from the carriage, signaled to the driver, and within minutes, her trunks were being unloaded onto the weathered steps of a house that had clearly not welcomed a guest in years. She sat frozen, waiting for him to change his mind, waiting for some flicker of the man who had, at least during the wedding ceremony, taken her hand with something resembling gentleness. That flicker did not come. "You are unwell," he said finally, as if reciting a line he had rehearsed. "The country air will do you good. I will send word when I can." And then he was gone. The carriage door shut, the wheels turned. Alara Whitfield, now Duchess of Thorne, watched the only connection she had to her old life disappear down a long dirt road, swallowed by fog and bare trees, until there was nothing left but silence and the creak of an old iron gate, swinging on its hinge. She stood alone on the steps of Blackmore, with 3 trunks, and no idea what waited for her inside. For a long moment, she considered simply sitting down on the cold stone and weeping. Her chest already ached with the familiar tightness that had plagued her since childhood, the illness that had made her the subject of pity and gossip for as long as she could remember. Frail Alara, they called her behind gloved hands at every ball she was too weak to fully enjoy. The girl who might not live to see 30. The girl no respectable family wanted for their sons, until her father's debts made her convenient for a duke who needed money more than he needed a wife he actually wanted. But sitting down and weeping would solve nothing. She had learned that lesson long ago, in sick beds and quiet rooms, while healthier children played outside windows she was too weak to open. So she took a breath, steadied herself against the porch railing, and knocked on the heavy wooden door. Nothing happened for a long time. She knocked again, harder, ignoring the way her knuckles ached in the cold. Finally, she heard the shuffle of footsteps, and the door opened, to reveal an older man, with tired eyes, and a coat that had clearly been mended more than once. "Yes?" he said, his tone somewhere between suspicion and exhaustion. "I am the Duchess of Thorne," Alara said, standing as tall as her small frame allowed. "I believe I will be staying here. May I come in?" The man's eyebrows rose slightly, though whether from surprise or disbelief, she could not tell. He stepped aside without a word, and she walked into a hall that smelled of dust and old wood smoke, its grandeur long faded beneath layers of neglect. "I am Hargrove," the man said, closing the door behind her. "Steward of this house, for whatever that title is still worth. We were not told to expect anyone." "I gathered as much," Alara said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the cold that had settled into her bones during the long carriage ride. "Is there somewhere I might sit, and perhaps something warm to drink?" Hargrove studied her for a moment, and Alara understood the look. She had seen it 1,000 times before, that assessment of her pale skin, her thin frame, the slight tremor in her hands from the cold. He was measuring how much trouble she would be. "This way," he said finally, and led her toward a sitting room, where a small fire had, mercifully, been left burning in the grate. As she settled into a worn armchair, Alara took her first real look at the room around her. The furniture was old but well made, the kind that had once belonged to a family of importance, before time and neglect had worn away its shine. A portrait hung above the fireplace, its subject's face darkened by decades of soot, impossible to make out clearly. She wondered who it had been, and how long it had been since anyone had cared enough to have it cleaned. "How many staff remain here?" she asked, when Hargrove returned with a cup of tea that smelled faintly of mint and chamomile. "6, my lady." "Myself," The housekeeper Margaret, 2 maids, a groundskeeper, and a boy who helps with the horses when there are any to tend. And how long has it been since the Duke last visited? Hargrove's expression flickered, just barely. Longer than I care to say, my lady. This house was his mother's favorite once. After she passed, he stopped coming. Alara wrapped her cold hands around the teacup, letting its warmth seep into her fingers. She thought of the man who had left her here without so much as a backward glance, and felt something harden in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but something new entirely. A resolve she had never needed before. "Thank you, Hargrove," she said quietly. "I do not intend to be a burden to this household. Whatever needs doing, I would like to help, if I am able." The steward's eyebrows rose again, more sharply this time. "My lady, you are the Duchess. You need not concern yourself with household matters." "I have spent most of my life being told what I need not concern myself with," Alara said, and there was a quiet steel in her voice that surprised even her. "I would like, for once, to be of use." That night, alone in a bedroom that had clearly not been slept in for years, Alara lay beneath blankets that smelled of cedar and dust, listening to the wind press against the old windows. She thought of her husband, riding away toward the capital without a single word of comfort, without so much as asking whether she would be warm enough, fed enough, cared for at all. She thought of the wedding, the cold ceremony, the way his hand had felt like holding a stranger's. She did not cry. She had promised herself, on the day her father told her of the arrangement, that she would not waste her limited strength on tears for a man who clearly had none to spare for her. Instead, she pressed her palm flat against her chest, feeling the familiar unsteady rhythm of her own heartbeat, and made herself a quiet promise. She would not simply survive this exile. She would build something out of it. The next morning, she woke before the sun had fully risen, dressed in the simplest gown she had brought, and made her way down to the kitchen, following the smell of wood smoke and the faint clatter of pots. She found a woman there, gray-haired and broad-shouldered, stirring something over the fire, with the tired efficiency of someone who had done the same task for decades, without help or thanks. "You must be Margaret," Alara said, standing in the doorway. The housekeeper turned, startled, nearly dropping her wooden spoon. "My lady, you should not be down here. Let me fetch your breakfast to your room." "I would rather eat here, if you don't mind the company," Alara said, and before Margaret could protest further, she had already seated herself at the worn kitchen table, folding her hands in her lap like a child, waiting to be scolded. Margaret hesitated, clearly unsure of the correct response to a duchess sitting in her kitchen at dawn. "As you wish, my lady," she said finally, and returned to her stirring, though Alara noticed the older woman's shoulders remained tense for the better part of an hour. Over the following days, Alara learned the rhythms of Blackmore, the way she had once learned the rhythms of her own illness, carefully, patiently, without complaint. She discovered that the estate's finances were in worse disarray than its dusty halls suggested, that the orchards to the east had been left to grow wild for want of a gardener, and that the chapel on the property had a roof so damaged that rain fell freely onto its stone floor. She discovered, too, that the staff who remained did so not out of loyalty to an absent duke, but out of a stubborn love for a house that had once, long ago, been full of warmth. She began, quietly, and without asking permission, to make small changes. She asked Margaret to teach her the household ledgers, insisting that her frail body did not mean her mind was equally weak. She spent her afternoons in the small estate library, going through years of neglected correspondence and financial records, piecing together a picture of exactly how much had been lost while no one was watching. It was on the 4th day, going through a stack of receipts that did not match the numbers in the main ledger, that she found the first sign of something deeply wrong. The figures for grain purchases were nearly double what the estate's own fields should have required, and yet the storehouses were nearly empty. Someone, at some point, had been taking far more than their fair share. She said nothing to Hargrove yet. She wanted to be certain first. She had learned, in her short and difficult life, that certainty was worth more than accusation, and that a frail girl who spoke too quickly was easy to dismiss, while a frail girl who spoke with proof in her hands was much harder to ignore. That evening, as she sat by the fire in the small sitting room, wrapped in a blanket against the persistent chill in her chest, Hargrove appeared in the doorway, his expression unusually hesitant. "My lady," he said, "I do not mean to overstep, but I have noticed you have been examining the estate ledgers." Alara looked up from the papers in her lap. "I have. I hope that does not trouble you." "Not trouble, exactly," Hargrove said, choosing his words carefully. "Only concern. Those books have not been properly kept since the old steward, Mr. Fenwick, left service 3 years ago. There may be things in there that are unpleasant to discover. I have already discovered a few," Alara said, holding up the stack of grain receipts. "Tell me, Hargrove, who approved these purchases?" The steward's face paled slightly as he took the papers from her hand, studying them in the firelight. His silence, as the minutes passed, told her more than any words could have. "These figures cannot be right," he murmured finally. "The grain purchases alone would have cost more than half the estate's yearly income, and yet the storehouses are nearly empty," Alara finished. "Yes, I noticed that too." Hargrove looked up at her, and for the first time since her arrival, she saw something shift in his expression, a reluctant respect creeping in beneath the careful formality he had maintained since her first knock on the door. "Someone has been stealing from this estate for years," he said quietly, "and no one noticed, because no one was looking closely enough." "Someone is looking now," Alara said, and though her voice remained soft, there was no mistaking the determination behind it. Over the following days, she and Hargrove worked side by side, comparing years of receipts against the estate's actual stores, tracing a pattern of theft that had clearly been going on since long before her arrival. It became clear that the previous steward, Mr. Fenwick, had been inflating purchase orders and pocketing the difference for years, likely counting on the fact that an absent duke would never bother to check the books himself. Alara found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely absorbed in a task that had nothing to do with her illness. She forgot, for hours at a stretch, the persistent ache in her chest, and the fatigue that usually crept up on her by midday. There was something deeply satisfying about untangling the deception, about proving, page by careful page, that she was not the useless invalid her husband had assumed her to be when he left her here to be forgotten. The other staff noticed the change too. Margaret began setting aside her best cuts of meat for the Duchess's meals without being asked, no longer treating her as a fragile guest to be managed, but as someone whose opinion, surprisingly, was worth seeking out. The younger maid, a shy girl named Lucy, began lingering in doorways when Alara passed, working up the courage to ask small questions about the outside world beyond Blackmore's walls. It was Lucy, in fact, who came to Alara one gray afternoon, with worry, written plainly across her young face. "My lady," she said, twisting her apron between nervous fingers. "It's my sister, Bridget. She works in the kitchen. She's taken ill, and I don't know what to do. Margaret has tried everything she knows, but the fever won't break." Alara set down the ledger she had been studying, and rose immediately, ignoring the slight dizziness that came from standing too quickly. "Take me to her." Lucy hesitated. "My lady, you needn't trouble yourself. You are not strong, and fevers can be dangerous. I only meant to ask if you knew of a physician nearby." "I have spent my entire life around illness, Lucy," Alara said gently. "I know fevers better than most physicians do. Please, take me to her." She found Bridget in a small room off the kitchen, sweating beneath too many blankets, her face flushed and her breathing shallow. Alara had seen this before, in her own body, more times than she cared to count. She sent Lucy for cool water and clean cloths, instructed Margaret to open the window despite the winter chill, and spent the next several hours sitting beside the young kitchen maid's bed, keeping her fever from climbing too high, speaking softly to keep her calm through the worst of it. By the time Bridget's fever finally broke, near dawn, Alara was exhausted in a way she had not felt in years, but it was a different kind of exhaustion than her illness usually brought. It was the tiredness of having done something that mattered. Word of the night spread quickly through the small household. By the following afternoon, even the groundskeeper, a quiet man named Tobias who rarely spoke to anyone, tipped his hat to her as she passed through the garden, a gesture of respect she had not expected and had certainly not asked for. She was beginning, without quite meaning to build something at Blackmore that had nothing to do with the husband who had abandoned her here. She was becoming, in the eyes of the small household that remained, someone worth protecting. But even as the days grew into weeks, and the weeks began to soften the sharp edges of her hurt, Alara could not entirely forget the silence from the capital. No letters came. No word of when, or if, her husband intended to return. She told herself she did not care, that she had found purpose enough within these neglected walls to fill whatever time she had left. But some nights, lying awake and listening to the wind, she wondered what it would take for a man like Alaric Thorne to remember that he had left a wife behind at all. She did not yet know that word of her quiet transformation was already beginning to travel farther than Blackmore's walls, carried in careful letters from Hargrove to the estate's man of business, whispered between servants who had once served in the capital and still had friends there. She did not know that somewhere in the city, her husband was about to hear things about his forgotten bride that would make him question everything he had assumed when he left her on those cold stone steps. For now, she only knew the ledgers in her lap, the fire crackling beside her, and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being needed. 3 weeks after Bridget's fever broke, a storm rolled in from the north, rattling the shutters of Blackmore with a fury that kept the entire household awake past midnight. Alara sat wrapped in blankets near the fire, watching rain lash against the windows, when Hargrove appeared in the doorway, with an unusual urgency in his step. "My lady, the east wall of the orchard shed has come down. Tobias is out there alone, trying to secure the roof before the rest collapses." Alara was on her feet before she had time to think about whether her body could handle the exertion. "Get lanterns. I'm coming with you." "My lady, the weather. Tobias has been alone at this estate for years, with no one to help him when things go wrong. I will not let him stay alone tonight." Her voice left no room for argument, and something in her tone must have convinced Hargrove, because he simply nodded and grabbed his coat. Outside, the wind tore at her cloak as she followed the bobbing lantern light toward the orchard. She found Tobias struggling against a length of fallen timber, rain streaming down his weathered face, his hands raw from gripping splintered wood. Without hesitation, Alara took up a length of rope Hargrove had brought and began securing the loose beam, while the two men worked to brace the collapsing wall. It was not glamorous work. Her dress was soaked through within minutes, her hands blistered by morning, and by the time the wall was secure enough to survive the night, she was shivering so hard her teeth chattered. But when Tobias finally straightened, wiping rain from his eyes, he looked at her with something she had never seen directed at her before, genuine astonishment mixed with respect. "You didn't have to do that, my lady," he said quietly, once they were back inside, dripping onto the kitchen floor, while Margaret fussed over them both with towels and hot broth. "Neither did you have to stay out there alone all these years, keeping this place standing, while everyone forgot about it," Alara replied, her voice hoarse from the cold. "We are the same, you and I, both left to manage things no one else bothered to care about." Tobias said nothing more that night, but from that day forward, he began leaving small offerings on her windowsill each morning: a sprig of early blooming flowers, a particularly good apple from the orchard, a smooth stone shaped like a heart he had found near the stream. Small things, quiet things, but they meant more to Alara than any of the expensive gifts that had occasionally arrived from distant relatives during her childhood illnesses, gifts given out of obligation rather than genuine care. The fever that came for her a week later was not unexpected. Her body, pushed harder than it had been in years, finally rebelled against the cold and the exertion, and she found herself confined to bed with the same illness she had spent Bridget's recovery tending. This time, it was Margaret and Lucy who sat by her side through the worst of it, taking turns through the night, refusing to leave, even when Alara weakly insisted she would be fine alone. "You stayed with Bridget," Margaret said simply, wringing out a cool cloth for Alara's forehead. "We stay with you. That is how it works in this house now." Alara, too weak to argue, simply closed her eyes and let herself be cared for, something she had rarely allowed herself to do, even during her worst illnesses at her father's estate, where servants had followed strict instructions rather than genuine concern. When she finally recovered, nearly a week later, she found the household had changed in her absence, in small but meaningful ways. Hargrove had taken it upon himself to draft a formal complaint against the former steward, Fenwick, compiling all the evidence of theft they had uncovered together, ready to send to whatever authority might act on it. Tobias had begun clearing the overgrown orchard paths on his own initiative, saying only that the Duchess had mentioned once wanting to see the apple trees properly tended before the season ended. Lucy had taught herself, from an old book in the library, the basics of estate correspondence, hoping to make herself useful should the Duchess need help with the growing pile of business matters. They had, without any of them quite realizing it, begun organizing themselves around her, the way a household organizes itself around someone they trust to lead. It was during this period of recovery that Alara turned her attention to the estate's chapel, long neglected and open to the rain through its damaged roof. She had noticed it on her first exploration of the grounds, tucked behind the main house, its stone walls still beautiful beneath decades of neglect. Something about its quiet abandonment had struck a chord in her, perhaps because she recognized in its forgotten state something of her own recent circumstances. She proposed, once she was strong enough to walk the grounds again, that they use what remained of the estate's very modest funds to repair the chapel roof before winter set in fully. Hargrove was hesitant at first, pointing out that funds were tight even without accounting for repairs, and that the Duke had given no instructions regarding such expenditures. The Duke gave no instructions regarding anything, Alara pointed out, not unkindly. He gave no instructions for my care, no instructions for the estate's management, no instructions for anything at all. I do not intend to wait for permission that will never come. This chapel matters to this house. I would like to see it saved. Something in her tone, perhaps the quiet steel that had grown stronger in her since her arrival, convinced Hargrove to agree. Together, they found a local craftsman willing to work at a reduced rate in exchange for a promise of continued business, and within 2 weeks, the chapel's roof had been patched well enough to withstand the coming winter storms. The day the repairs were finished, Alara walked alone into the small stone building, standing beneath its restored ceiling, listening to the quiet that settled over the space, now that rain no longer dripped through broken beams. She thought of her wedding day, the cold formality of the ceremony, the absence of anything resembling warmth or promise. This chapel, small and forgotten as it was, felt more meaningful to her than the grand cathedral where she had exchanged vows with a man who barely looked at her. She did not know, standing there in the quiet, that word of her efforts had already begun traveling beyond Blackmore's walls. Hargrove, in his formal complaint against Fenwick, had included details of the Duchess's role in uncovering the theft, praising her diligence and intelligence in terms that would eventually reach the desk of Alaric's own man of business in the capital. The craftsman who repaired the chapel roof spoke of the young Duchess who had personally overseen the work, comparing her favorably to other noble ladies he had served who rarely left their sitting rooms. Small stories, carried by small people, slowly building into something larger than any of them realized. As autumn deepened into the first frost of the season, Alara found herself settling into a rhythm at Blackmore that felt, for the first time in her life, genuinely her own. She rose early, to work through household matters with Hargrove, spent her afternoons walking the orchard paths that Tobias had cleared, and her evenings by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes simply enjoying the comfortable silence of a household that had come to feel, against all odds, like home. She still thought of Alaric, more often than she cared to admit. She wondered what kept him so occupied in the capital, that he could not spare even a single letter to inquire after her health. She wondered if he thought of her at all, or if she had already faded from his mind entirely, a minor inconvenience settled and forgotten. Some nights, the hurt of his absence pressed sharply against her chest, sharper even than the illness that had plagued her since childhood. But she refused to let that hurt define her days. Instead, she poured herself into the estate, into the people who had, quietly and without fanfare, chosen to care for her in ways her own husband had not. She began teaching Lucy to read more fluently, spending an hour each evening, going through simple texts together. She helped Bridget, fully recovered from her fever, develop a small kitchen garden of medicinal herbs, drawing on her own lifetime of knowledge about remedies and treatments. She spent long afternoons with Margaret, learning the older woman's stories of Blackmore in its better days, when Alaric's mother had still been alive, and the halls had rung with laughter instead of echoing silence. It was Margaret, in fact, who first spoke openly of the late Duchess, Alaric's mother, one quiet evening as they sat together mending linens by the fire. She was a formidable woman, the old Duchess, Margaret said, her needle pausing in the fabric. Sharp mind, sharper tongue when she needed it. She loved this estate more than the townhouse in the city, said the city air made her feel small, while Blackmore made her feel like herself. What happened, after she passed? Alara asked quietly. Margaret's expression softened with old grief. The young master took it hard, harder than anyone expected, given how distant he'd always seemed. He stopped visiting altogether, said the place reminded him too much of what he'd lost. I think, my lady, if I may speak plainly, that grief made him cold in ways he never intended. It happens sometimes, to people who don't know how to carry sorrow properly. Alara considered this information carefully, turning it over in her mind, long after the conversation had ended. It did not excuse Alaric's abandonment of her, nor his failure to write even a single word of comfort in the weeks since, but it offered, perhaps, a small window into understanding the man she had married. A glimpse of grief buried so deep it had calcified into something resembling indifference. She found herself, despite everything, wondering if the man who had left her here was capable of becoming someone different, given enough time and enough reason to try. That question remained unanswered, as winter's first true snow began to fall over Blackmore, blanketing the orchard and the newly repaired chapel in soft white silence. Alara stood at her bedroom window one particularly cold evening, watching snowflakes drift past the glass, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a different version of her life. One where her husband stood beside her at this window, instead of somewhere far away in the capital, forgetting she existed. She did not yet know that in the capital, that same evening, Alaric Thorne sat alone in his study, staring at a letter from his own man of business that contained details about his estate's affairs he had never expected to read. Details that spoke not of a frail, forgettable wife, but of a woman who had uncovered years of theft, repaired a crumbling chapel, and earned the fierce loyalty of an entire household in his absence. She did not know that somewhere far from Blackmore's snow-covered walls, the first cracks were beginning to form in the careful indifference her husband had built around himself, cracks that would eventually lead him back to the estate he had abandoned, and to the wife he had never truly known. For now, she only knew the snow, the fire, and the quiet, growing certainty that whatever happened next, she would face it as someone stronger than the frail bride who had once stood weeping on these same cold steps. In the capital, Alaric Thorne read the letter from his man of business, Nathaniel Cross, for the third time, as though repetition might change the words on the page. The letter described, in careful and precise language, the discovery of years of theft at Blackmore, uncovered not by any steward or overseer he had appointed, but by his own wife, working quietly through neglected ledgers, with nothing but patience and a sharp mind to guide her. He set the letter down on his desk and stared at the fire burning in his study, unable to reconcile the woman described in Cross's careful account with the pale, silent girl he had left on Blackmore's steps months earlier. He remembered her only vaguely, a thin figure in a wedding gown too heavy for her frame, eyes that had watched him with something between fear and resignation as he explained, in the coldest terms he could manage, that he had urgent business elsewhere. He had told himself, in the weeks since, that he had done her a kindness by leaving her somewhere quiet and undisturbed, away from the demands and cruelties of society that would have surely worn down her fragile constitution within a season. He had told himself many things, in fact, none of which he examined too closely, because examining them meant acknowledging the truth he had been avoiding since his mother's death, that he did not know how to be present for people who needed him, and so he had simply chosen not to be present at all. His mother's passing had hollowed something out of him that he had never bothered to fill back in. She had been the only person who ever truly saw him, who ever pushed past his careful reserve to find the boy underneath the ducal title, and when she died, he had retreated so far into himself that even his closest advisors struggled to reach him. Marriage to Alara Whitfield had been, for him, simply another obligation to be managed rather than a genuine union to be built, a debt settled through a wedding contract rather than a beginning of something new. But the letter in front of him painted a different picture entirely, one he found himself unable to dismiss. He called for Nathaniel Cross the following morning, demanding a full accounting of everything the man had learned about Blackmore's affairs. Cross arrived within the hour, a lean, precise man who had served the Thorne family for over a decade, and rarely wasted words on anything but necessary information. "Your Grace," Cross began, settling into the chair across from Alaric's desk. "I trust you received my letter regarding the situation at Blackmore." "I did. Tell me more. Tell me everything you know about my wife's activities there." Cross's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise at the directness of the request, but he answered without hesitation. The Duchess uncovered a significant pattern of theft perpetrated by your former steward, Mr. Fenwick, over the course of several years. The evidence she compiled, working alongside your current steward Hargrove, was thorough enough that I was able to draft formal recovery proceedings within days of receiving it. We expect to recover a substantial portion of the stolen funds. And the chapel repairs Hargrove mentioned in his letter? Arranged and completed entirely at the Duchess's initiative, using estate funds she allocated herself, without instruction from your office. I understand she also personally nursed a sick kitchen maid back to health, and assisted in securing storm damage to the orchard shed during a night of severe weather. Alaric leaned back in his chair, absorbing this information with a growing sense of disorientation. This does not sound like the woman I left at Blackmore. Perhaps not, Your Grace, Cross said carefully, but it appears to be an accurate account of the woman currently residing there. After Cross departed, Alaric remained alone in his study for a long while, staring at nothing in particular. He thought of his own behavior in the months since the wedding, the letters he had failed to write, the visits he had failed to make, the wife he had essentially discarded without a second thought, because she had seemed, at the time, like little more than an obligation to be managed and forgotten. He thought of his mother, and what she would have said had she witnessed her son treating anyone, let alone his own wife, with such casual disregard. The thought was uncomfortable enough that he poured himself a drink and did not finish it, setting it aside, untouched, as he sat with the weight of his own neglect, for perhaps the first time since his mother's funeral. Meanwhile, at Blackmore, life continued in its newly established rhythm, unaware of the quiet reckoning taking place in the capital. Elara had begun, with the arrival of winter's full force, focusing her attention on the household's preparations for the coldest months ahead. She worked alongside Margaret to ensure the pantries were properly stocked, alongside Tobias to secure the animal shelters against the harsh weather, and alongside Hargrove to finalize the recovery proceedings against Fenwick, whose theft had been formally documented and submitted for legal action. It was during this period that a visitor arrived at Blackmore's gates, unannounced and unexpected. Elara was in the sitting room, reviewing correspondence with Hargrove, when Lucy appeared in the doorway, her expression tight with unease. "My lady, there is a gentleman at the door. He says he is a cousin of the Duke's, and that he has come to check on the estate's affairs in his cousin's absence." Elara exchanged a glance with Hargrove, whose expression had shifted immediately into something wary and alert. "Did he give a name?" "Mr. Edmund Colt, my lady. He says it is urgent." Hargrove's jaw tightened visibly. "I know that name, my lady. Mr. Colt is a distant cousin of the Duke's, though I have never known him to take any genuine interest in Blackmore's affairs before now. If I may speak plainly, his sudden concern strikes me as suspicious, particularly given the timing." Elara considered this information carefully. The theft they had uncovered, the recovery proceedings now underway, and the sudden arrival of a distant relative claiming concern for the estate's welfare, seemed, to her increasingly sharp instincts, like more than mere coincidence. "Show him to the sitting room," she said finally. "But Hargrove, I would like you present for the conversation, and I would like all estate documents secured before he arrives." Hargrove nodded, understanding immediately, and hurried to gather the relevant papers, while Lucy went to retrieve their unexpected guest. Mr. Edmund Colt entered the sitting room, with the confident stride of a man accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went, his clothing fine but slightly worn at the edges, the mark of someone maintaining appearances beyond his actual means. He bowed slightly to Elara, though his eyes swept the room with a calculating quickness that did not escape her notice. "Duchess Thorne," he said smoothly, "what a pleasure to finally make your acquaintance. I have heard so much about you, though I confess, I did not expect to find you looking so well, given the reports of your health." "You are too kind, Mr. Colt," Elara replied, keeping her tone politely neutral. "I understand you have come regarding the estate's affairs. I must say, I am curious what has prompted such concern, given that I have not had the pleasure of your company in the months since my arrival here." Colt's smile flickered, just barely, before settling back into its practiced ease. "Family obligation, my dear Duchess. With my cousin so occupied in the capital, I felt it my duty to ensure the estate remains in proper order. I understand there has been some unpleasantness with the previous steward." "There has been theft, Mr. Colt, if that is what you mean by unpleasantness. Theft that has already been documented and submitted for proper legal proceedings. I assure you, the matter is well in hand. Of course, Colt said, waving a dismissive hand. Still, given the significant sums involved, I thought it prudent to review the relevant documents myself, simply to ensure everything has been handled correctly. Perhaps I might see the estate's current financial records? Alara felt Hargrove tense beside her, and she understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what Colt was attempting. He had come not out of genuine concern, but hoping to find disorder he could exploit, financial confusion he might twist to his own advantage, perhaps even documents he could use to claim some manner of authority over the estate in his cousin's continued absence. I am afraid that will not be possible, Mr. Colt, she said, her voice remaining perfectly pleasant despite the firmness beneath it. The estate's affairs are being managed appropriately by myself and Mr. Hargrove, under the full authority granted to me as Duchess of Thorn. Any concerns you have may be directed to my husband's man of business in the capital, Mr. Nathaniel Cross, who is fully informed of all relevant proceedings. Colt's expression hardened slightly, the polished charm slipping just enough to reveal something sharper underneath. I only wish to help, Duchess. Surely you understand how difficult it must be, managing such matters in your condition. My condition, Mr. Colt, has not prevented me from uncovering years of theft that went unnoticed by everyone else, including, I imagine, anyone who might have benefited from such theft continuing undetected. Alara held his gaze steadily, watching his expression flicker with something close to alarm. I trust you understand my meaning. The silence that followed stretched long enough to become genuinely uncomfortable. Finally, Colt rose, his smile returning, though it no longer reached his eyes. I see you are quite capable of managing your own affairs, Duchess. I shall take my leave then, and trouble you no further. After he departed, Hargrove turned to Alara, with visible relief mixed with concern. My lady, I do not trust that man. I believe he may return, particularly if he suspects there is opportunity here worth pursuing. Then we shall be ready for him, Alara said, though privately she felt a flicker of unease at the thought. She was managing well enough on her own strength, but she recognized, with growing clarity, that a man like Colt would not simply disappear after one unsuccessful visit. He would look for other ways in, other weaknesses to exploit. That evening, she sat down and wrote her first letter to Nathaniel Cross, detailing Colt's visit and requesting guidance on how best to protect the estate from any further interference. She did not write to Alaric directly, unwilling to appear as though she were pleading for his attention or protection, but she made certain, through careful and precise language, that word of the situation would reach him regardless, through the proper channels of business, rather than the vulnerable channel of a wife's unanswered heart. She did not know, as she sealed the letter and handed it to Hargrove for delivery, that her husband was already, in the quiet privacy of his own study, beginning to feel the weight of everything he had left behind, at Blackmore pressing more insistently against his conscience each day. The winter deepened around Blackmore's walls, but within them, something else was deepening too, a quiet resolve, shared now among every member of the small household, to protect the woman who had, in a few short months, transformed from a frail stranger into someone worth defending with everything they had. Edmund Colt did not disappear after his failed attempt to gain access to Blackmore's financial records. Instead, he retreated to a small inn in the nearby village, where he spent his evenings drinking more than he should and complaining loudly to anyone who would listen about the ungrateful Duchess who had refused his generous offer of assistance. It did not take long for word of his complaints to reach Blackmore itself, carried by a delivery boy who frequented both the inn and the estate's kitchen entrance. "He's telling everyone in the village that you're hiding something, my lady," Bridget reported one morning, setting down a tray of fresh bread with more force than necessary. "Says you and Hargrove are cooking the books yourselves, and that the theft story is nothing but a cover for your own schemes." Alara felt a flash of anger at the accusation, quickly followed by something calmer and more calculating. The proceedings against Fenwick are a matter of public record now, filed with proper legal authorities. Anyone who wishes to verify our honesty may do so easily enough. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but not everyone bothers to verify things before they believe them," Margaret said quietly from where she stood near the stove. "Rumors have a way of spreading faster than truth, especially when they come from someone with a title, even a distant one." Alara knew Margaret was right, and the knowledge settled uncomfortably in her chest throughout the day. She had spent months proving herself to the household at Blackmore, earning their trust through action rather than words. But the wider world beyond the estate's walls knew nothing of that transformation. To them, she remained simply the frail duchess left behind by an absent husband, an easy target for whatever story Edmund Colt chose to spread. That evening, she called Hargrove into the sitting room for a private conversation, her expression more serious than he had seen in weeks. "I believe we need to act, rather than simply wait for Mr. Colt to grow tired of his schemes," she said, once the door was closed. "Tell me honestly, Hargrove, what do you believe he actually wants from this estate?" Hargrove considered the question carefully before answering. "Money, most likely, my lady. I have heard rumors over the years that Mr. Colt has accumulated significant debts of his own, debts that a distant relation to a wealthy duke might hope to resolve through creative means. If he could convince enough people that you and I were mismanaging the estate, he might attempt to have himself appointed as overseer in your place, particularly given the duke's continued absence. And if he succeeded in that, he would have access to estate funds, my lady, funds he could easily divert for his own purposes, while the duke remained none the wiser in the capital." Ilara absorbed this information with growing determination. "Then we must ensure he never gets that opportunity. I want copies of every document related to the Fenwick proceedings, sent not only to Mr. Cross, but to the local magistrate as well, so there can be no question of impropriety on our part. And I want a formal letter drafted, in my own hand, describing Mr. Colt's visit and his subsequent behavior in the village, sent directly to my husband's office." Hargrove nodded, already moving toward the writing desk to begin the necessary correspondence. But before he could sit, Ilara spoke again, her voice softer this time. "Hargrove, I must ask you something, and I would appreciate an honest answer. Do you believe my husband will act on this information, once he receives it, or will he continue to leave these matters entirely in my hands, as he has done with everything else since our marriage?" The steward paused, choosing his words with visible care. "My lady, I cannot speak to what is in the Duke's heart, as I have had little contact with him these past years. But I can tell you that the letters Mr. Cross has sent regarding your activities here have not gone unanswered. Mr. Cross's own correspondence has grown increasingly detailed of late, suggesting the Duke has taken a keener interest in Blackmore's affairs than he has shown in a long while." This information offered Ilara a small measure of comfort, though she was careful not to let herself hope too much. She had learned, through months of silence, not to expect too much from a man who had shown so little regard for her well-being in the early days of their marriage. The letter she wrote that night to Alaric's office was measured and professional, detailing Colt's visit and subsequent rumors without a trace of the hurt or frustration she genuinely felt. She described the situation as a matter requiring the Duke's attention, framing it entirely in terms of estate management rather than personal grievance. She would not, she decided, give her husband the satisfaction of knowing how deeply his absence continued to wound her, even as she found new purpose and strength within the walls he had left her to manage alone. As the letter made its way toward the capital, life at Blackmore continued, despite the shadow of Colt's schemes hanging over the household. Ilara turned her attention toward preparations for the approaching midwinter celebrations, a tradition Margaret described with wistful nostalgia as one the estate had not properly observed since the old duchess's passing. She loved this time of year, Margaret explained one evening, as they sat together planning simple decorations from what materials the estate could spare. Used to have the whole staff gathered in the great hall, sharing a proper feast, singing the old songs late into the night. It's been so long since this house heard any real laughter, my lady. Ilara felt a familiar ache at Margaret's words, a longing for the kind of warmth and belonging she had rarely experienced even within her own childhood home, where her illness had often kept her separated from the ordinary joys other children took for granted. She resolved, then and there, to give Blackmore's household a proper celebration, regardless of how modest their resources might be. Over the following weeks, the entire staff threw themselves into preparations, with an enthusiasm that surprised even Ilara. Tobias brought in evergreen branches from the orchard to decorate the great hall. Bridget and Margaret worked together on simple but hearty dishes, making the most of the estate's limited stores. Lucy, with her newly developed reading skills, found an old book of traditional midwinter songs in the library and began teaching them to the rest of the household during quiet evening hours. Even Hargrove, normally so reserved and formal, seemed to soften as the celebration approached, sharing small memories of Blackmore's better days with a warmth Elara had not seen from him before. The night of the celebration itself arrived cold and clear, stars visible through breaks in the winter clouds as the household gathered in the great hall, its neglected grandeur transformed by candlelight and evergreen boughs into something genuinely festive. Elara sat among her small household, sharing simple food and simpler company, listening to Lucy's tentative but earnest singing of old songs, watching Tobias attempt, with visible embarrassment, to join in the chorus. For the first time since her wedding day, Elara felt something close to genuine happiness settle over her, unburdened by illness or loneliness or the persistent ache of her husband's absence. She looked around at the faces gathered in the candlelight, people who had chosen, without any obligation beyond their own hearts, to care for her and protect her and build something meaningful alongside her in this forgotten corner of the world. It was during a quiet moment in the evening's festivities that Hargrove approached her with a small, carefully wrapped parcel. "The staff wished for you to have this, my lady," he said, his usually formal tone touched with something warmer. "We know it is not much, but we hope it conveys our gratitude for everything you have done for this household since your arrival." Elara opened the parcel to find a simple wooden box, carved with delicate care by Tobias's steady hands, containing a collection of pressed flowers from the orchard, each one labeled in Lucy's careful handwriting, with the date it had bloomed throughout the past season. "We thought," Lucy explained shyly, "that you might like a way to remember your first year here, my lady. Even the difficult parts. Especially the difficult parts, perhaps, since you turned so many of them into something good." Elara found herself unable to speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by the simple thoughtfulness of the gift and everything it represented. She had arrived at Blackmore as an unwanted burden, discarded by a husband who saw her as little more than an obligation to be managed from a distance. But somewhere in the months since, without quite realizing when it had happened, she had become someone genuinely cherished by the people around her. People who had chosen her not out of duty or obligation, but out of real affection, earned through shared hardship and mutual respect. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "This means more to me than you could possibly know." As the celebration continued late into the night, Elara allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply enjoy the moment, without worrying about what challenges tomorrow might bring. Whatever happened with Edmund Colt's schemes, whatever silence continued to stretch across the distance between herself and her absent husband, she had built something real and lasting within these walls. She had built a family, of sorts, out of people who had chosen her freely and completely. She did not know that in the capital, that same night, Alaric Thorne sat alone at his own quiet dinner table, surrounded by wealth and comfort that felt increasingly hollow, thinking of a wife he had never bothered to know, and wondering, with growing discomfort, what exactly he had thrown away when he left her behind at Blackmore's forgotten gates. The letter describing Edmund Colt's visit reached Alaric Thorne on a gray morning in late winter, delivered alongside a stack of other correspondence he had been putting off reviewing. He recognized his wife's handwriting immediately, elegant but firm, and felt an unexpected tightness in his chest as he broke the seal and began to read. Her words were measured and professional, describing Colt's attempt to access the estate's financial records, the subsequent rumors spreading through the village, and the potential threat to Blackmore's proper management should such schemes go unchecked. There was no plea for his attention buried in the careful language, no hint of the loneliness or hurt he might have expected from a wife left alone for months, without word from her husband. It read, if anything, like a report from a competent estate manager, rather than a letter from an abandoned bride. Somehow, that professional distance stung more than any accusation could have. He set the letter down and called immediately for Nathaniel Cross, his mind already working through the implications of what he had read. Edmund Colt was, as Elara had suspected, deeply in debt, a fact Cross confirmed within the hour, after consulting his own network of information throughout the capital. "Mr. Colt has accumulated significant gambling debts over the past 2 years, Your Grace," Cross reported. "It would not surprise me if he saw an opportunity in Blackmore's temporarily unsupervised state, hoping to position himself as a trusted family overseer, while quietly diverting funds to settle his own obligations. And my wife recognized this immediately, while I remained entirely unaware of the danger, Alaric said, more to himself than to Cross. The Duchess has proven remarkably perceptive in matters concerning the estate, Your Grace. I would go so far as to say that Blackmore has benefited significantly from her presence, far beyond what I would have expected, given the circumstances of her arrival there. Alaric absorbed this observation in silence, the weight of it settling uncomfortably alongside everything else he had learned about his wife over the past weeks. He thought of the wedding day, the way he had barely spoken to her beyond the necessary vows, the way he had dismissed her almost entirely from his thoughts, once the carriage carried her away from the capital. He had assumed, without ever bothering to truly consider the alternative, that she would remain quietly at Blackmore, managed by his staff, unremarkable and easily forgotten. Instead, she had become the very heart of the estate he had abandoned, earning the loyalty of servants he barely remembered employing, uncovering theft that had gone unnoticed for years, and now standing firm against a scheming relative, without so much as requesting his assistance. "Draft a formal response to Mr. Colt," Alaric said finally, his voice carrying a new firmness that surprised even himself. "Make clear that any further interference in Blackmore's affairs will be met with legal consequences, and send word to the Duchess that her handling of the situation has my full support and authorization for whatever measures she deems necessary to protect the estate." Cross nodded, making note of the instructions, though something in his expression suggested he was pleased by this sudden shift in his employer's attention toward matters he had previously ignored entirely. After Cross departed, Alaric remained alone in his study, staring at his wife's letter, until the words began to blur together. He found himself, for the first time since his mother's death, genuinely curious about another person's inner life, wondering what Alara's days at Blackmore actually looked like, beyond the careful professional accounts relayed through Hargrove and Cross. He wondered if she thought of him at all, beyond the necessity of managing correspondence related to estate matters. He wondered, with a discomfort that surprised him, whether she had come to hate him for what he had done. The thought lingered with him through the following days, growing increasingly difficult to ignore, as more reports arrived from Blackmore, detailing his wife's continued efforts on the estate's behalf. He learned of the midwinter celebration she had organized, described in a letter from Hargrove, with evident affection for the young Duchess, who had brought warmth back to a house that had known only silence since his mother's passing. He learned of her efforts, teaching the household's younger members to read, of her careful management of household finances, of the quiet, steady leadership she had provided in his absence. Each report chipped away further at the careful indifference he had built around himself since his mother's death, an indifference that had allowed him to move through the world without genuinely engaging with anyone, without risking the kind of loss that had hollowed him out so completely years earlier. It was during a particularly restless night, unable to sleep despite the late hour, that Alaric found himself pulling out his mother's old letters, kept carefully preserved in a locked drawer of his desk since her passing. He had not read them in years, unable to face the grief they stirred, but something about his wife's quiet resilience at Blackmore made him want to revisit his mother's words, to remember the woman who had once told him, in her final months, that the greatest failure a person could commit was allowing fear of loss to prevent them from truly living. He read through the letters late into the night, his mother's familiar handwriting bringing back memories of a childhood spent at Blackmore before duty and grief had pulled him away entirely. He remembered his mother's love for the estate, her insistence that a house was only as good as the people who cared for it, her belief that true strength came not from wealth or title, but from genuine connection with those around you. By the time dawn broke over the capital, Alaric had made a decision he had been avoiding for months. He would return to Blackmore, not simply to manage estate business or address the threat of Edmund Colt's schemes, but to finally meet the woman his wife had become in his absence, and perhaps, if he was fortunate enough, to begin making amends for the neglect he had shown her since the very beginning of their marriage. He did not send word ahead of his intentions, uncertain of what reception he might receive, and unwilling to give himself the opportunity to talk himself out of the journey once the decision had been made. He simply began the necessary preparations, arranging his affairs in the capital to allow for an extended absence, gathering what he hoped might serve as appropriate gestures of apology, though he remained uncertain whether any gesture could truly account for the months of silence and neglect he had inflicted upon his wife. As he prepared for the journey, he found himself reflecting more deeply on the reasons behind his own behavior since his mother's death. He had told himself, for so long, that keeping people at a distance protected him from the pain of loss, that avoiding genuine connection was simply practical wisdom, learned through hard experience. But sitting with his mother's letters, reading her words of encouragement and wisdom penned in the final months of her illness, he began to understand that he had not protected himself at all. He had simply postponed a different kind of loss, the slow erosion of a life lived at arm's length from everyone who might have genuinely mattered to him. His wife, whom he had dismissed so easily as merely another obligation to be managed, had somehow found the strength to build genuine connection and purpose out of the very abandonment he had inflicted upon her. She had taken his neglect and transformed it into an opportunity for growth he had never expected, becoming someone worthy of the household's fierce loyalty, while he remained isolated in his own carefully constructed indifference. The journey to Blackmore would take several days through winter roads still treacherous with ice and snow, but Alaric found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely eager to reach his destination. He did not know what reception awaited him there, whether his wife would greet his return with relief or resentment, whether the household that had come to protect her so fiercely would view his arrival as welcome or intrusive. But he knew, with growing certainty, as the carriage began its journey away from the capital, that he could no longer continue living the way he had been living, hiding from genuine connection behind walls of duty and formal obligation. Whatever awaited him at Blackmore, he intended to face it honestly, prepared finally to become the husband he should have been from the very beginning. Behind him, in the capital, the rumors Edmund Colt had spread began to unravel under the weight of the Duke's formal response. The legal proceedings against Fenwick moving forward with renewed authority, now that Alaric's office had thrown its full support behind the Duchess's actions. Colt, recognizing the shifting tide against his schemes, quietly withdrew his complaints and disappeared from the village near Blackmore, unwilling to risk further exposure of his own precarious financial situation. At Blackmore itself, unaware of the journey now underway toward its gates, Elara continued her quiet work managing the estate's affairs, still uncertain whether her husband would ever respond meaningfully to the letters and reports she had sent, still unaware that the man who had abandoned her months earlier was now traveling steadily through winter roads, carrying with him a growing determination to finally become someone worthy of the household she had built in his absence. Word of Edmund Colt's sudden retreat from the village reached Blackmore a full day before any hint of the Duke's approaching journey, carried by the same delivery boy who had once brought news of Colt's complaints. Elara received the information with quiet relief, though she remained cautious, unwilling to assume the threat had entirely passed, until she heard something more official from her husband's office in the capital. "He simply vanished, my lady," the boy reported, clearly relishing his role as bearer of interesting news. "Settled his tab at the inn, and left in the middle of the night, according to the innkeeper. No one's seen him since. Perhaps he finally realized his schemes would not succeed here," Elara said, though privately she suspected there was more to the story than a simple change of heart. She learned the truth of it 2 days later, when a formal letter arrived from Nathaniel Cross, detailing the Duke's response to Colt's interference, including the legal warnings issued against any further attempts to meddle in Blackmore's affairs. The letter also confirmed, in careful but unmistakable language, that the Duke had expressed his full support for the Duchess's handling of the estate's affairs, along with authorization for whatever measures she deemed necessary going forward. Elara read the letter twice, searching for some hint of personal sentiment buried within the formal business language, some acknowledgement beyond mere professional courtesy. She found none, and told herself firmly that she had not expected to find any, that the letter's practical support was more than she had received in the months since her arrival at Blackmore, and should be sufficient on its own. But that evening, alone in her bedroom, she allowed herself a small measure of disappointment at the continued absence of anything resembling genuine warmth from her husband, even as she recognized how much progress had been made simply in his willingness to act on her behalf against Colt's schemes. She did not know that even as she read Cross's letter, Alaric himself was drawing steadily closer to Blackmore, his carriage making its way through winter roads that had grown increasingly familiar the further north he traveled. He found himself remembering details of the journey from childhood visits to the estate. Landmarks he had not thought of in years, suddenly resurfacing, with startling clarity, as the carriage passed through villages he had once known well. The closer he drew to Blackmore, the more his earlier confidence began to waver, replaced by a growing uncertainty about how he might actually explain himself once he arrived. He had spent the journey composing various speeches in his mind, attempts at apology and explanation that all seemed inadequate the moment he tried to imagine actually speaking them aloud to a wife he barely knew and had treated so poorly. He arrived at the outskirts of the estate on a cold, clear afternoon, the winter sun casting long shadows across snow-covered fields he remembered from a childhood that felt increasingly distant. As the carriage rolled up the familiar drive toward the main house, he found himself studying the property with fresh eyes, noting details he had never bothered to observe closely during his brief, distracted visit months earlier. The orchard, which he vaguely remembered as overgrown and neglected during his last visit, now showed clear signs of careful tending, its trees pruned and its paths cleared despite the winter season. The chapel, which he recalled as having a damaged roof his mother had complained about years before her passing, now stood intact, its stone walls freshly repaired. Even the main house itself seemed somehow different, though he could not immediately identify the specific changes, only a general sense that the property had been cared for by someone who genuinely valued it, rather than simply maintained by staff following minimal instructions. The carriage came to a stop in front of the main entrance, and Alaric stepped down onto the same steps where he had left his wife months earlier, without so much as a proper farewell. The memory of that departure settled uncomfortably in his chest as he approached the door, uncertain of what reception awaited him. The door opened before he could knock, revealing Hargrove, whose expression shifted rapidly from surprise to something more guarded as he recognized the Duke standing before him. "Your Grace," Hargrove said, his tone carefully neutral. "We were not expecting your arrival." "I did not send word ahead," Alaric admitted. "I apologize for the lack of notice. Is my wife available? I would like to speak with her." Something flickered across Hargrove's face, a hesitation that surprised Alaric, given the steward's usual formal composure. "The Duchess is currently in the orchard, Your Grace, overseeing some winter preparations with our groundskeeper. If you would care to wait inside, I will send word of your arrival. I would prefer to find her myself, if that would not be an inconvenience." Hargrove hesitated again, clearly weighing something in his mind, before finally nodding and gesturing toward the path that led around the main house, toward the orchard beyond. As Alaric made his way along the familiar path, he could not shake the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted at Blackmore since his last visit, something beyond the mere physical improvements to the property itself. He found Alara exactly where Hargrove had indicated, standing among the bare orchard trees alongside a weathered man, Alaric vaguely recognized as the estate's longtime groundskeeper. She was dressed simply, a warm cloak wrapped around her slight frame, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold winter air, as she gestured toward one of the trees, apparently discussing some matter of pruning or protection against the season's harsh weather. She looked different than he remembered, though he struggled to identify exactly how. She stood with a straighter posture, spoke with clear confidence to the groundskeeper beside her, moved with a purpose and assurance entirely absent from the pale, silent bride he had left on the estate's steps months earlier. Even from a distance, he could see something in her that had not been there before, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her despite her still slight frame. Tobias noticed the Duke's approach first, his weathered face shifting into an expression of surprise and something less welcoming than Alaric might have expected from an estate employee greeting his employer's return. He said something quietly to Alara, who turned to follow his gaze, her expression, when she recognized her husband approaching, revealing a complicated mixture of surprise and something Alaric could not quite identify. "Alaric," she said, her voice steady despite the surprise evident on her face. "I was not aware you intended to visit." "I did not send word ahead," he repeated, feeling suddenly awkward and uncertain, in a way he rarely experienced, even in the most demanding social situations of the capital. "I hope my arrival is not unwelcome." Alara studied him for a long moment before responding, and Alaric found himself unable to read anything definitive in her careful expression. "You are the Duke of this estate, Alaric. Your arrival is neither welcome nor unwelcome. It simply is what it is." The response, delivered without any trace of bitterness or accusation, somehow stung more sharply than any angry outburst might have. He recognized in her measured tone the same professional distance that had characterized her recent letters, a careful reserve that suggested she had learned, in his absence, not to expect anything genuine from him at all. "I received the reports of your work here," he said, unsure how else to begin the conversation. He had been rehearsing for days, without ever quite finding the right words. "The theft you uncovered, the repairs to the chapel, the situation with Mr. Colt. I wanted to see for myself what you have accomplished, and to thank you properly for your efforts. The efforts were necessary, given the state you left this estate in," Elara replied, her tone still measured, but with a hint of something sharper beneath the surface. "I did what needed to be done. There is no need for thanks." Tobias, standing nearby, with visible discomfort at witnessing this exchange, cleared his throat quietly. "Begging your pardon, your grace, my lady, but I should return to the shed. There's work still needing done before the light fades." Elara nodded her permission, and the groundskeeper departed quickly, leaving husband and wife alone among the bare orchard trees for the first time since their brief, cold wedding day months earlier. "Elara," Alaric said, using her given name for what felt like the first time since their vows, "I owe you an apology, far greater than I know how to properly express. I left you here without proper care, without word or comfort, without any consideration for what you might need or deserve as my wife. I have no adequate explanation for my behavior, only the acknowledgement that it was wrong, and that I intend to make amends, if you will allow me the opportunity." Elara remained silent for a long moment, studying his face with an intensity that made him distinctly uncomfortable, accustomed as he was to people rarely looking at him so directly. "You left me here to be forgotten, Alaric," she said finally, her voice quiet but unmistakably firm. "I built something here despite that abandonment, not because of any support or care you provided. The household that surrounds me now chose to protect and care for me freely, without obligation, in ways you never once considered offering yourself. I am grateful for your apology, but I confess I do not yet know what to do with it, given everything that has happened in the months since you left." The honesty of her words, delivered without cruelty but with unmistakable clarity, settled heavily in Alaric's chest as he recognized, perhaps for the first time, the true weight of what his neglect had cost them both. The evening of Alaric's arrival passed in a strange, uncomfortable silence throughout Blackmore's halls. Dinner was served in the formal dining room rather than the cozy kitchen table Elara had grown accustomed to over the past months, a return to the kind of stiff formality she had hoped to leave behind entirely. Alaric sat across from her, attempting several times to begin conversations that faltered quickly under the weight of everything unspoken between them. The household staff, meanwhile, moved through their duties with visible tension, exchanging careful glances that suggested a collective wariness toward the Duke's sudden return. Margaret served the meal with perfect professional courtesy, though Elara noticed the older woman's usual warmth had retreated entirely behind a formal mask reserved, apparently, specifically for the master of the house. After dinner, Alaric requested a private conversation with Hargrove, and Elara retreated to her sitting room, uncertain what to make of the day's unexpected developments. She had spent months building a life at Blackmore, entirely independent of her husband's presence or approval, and his sudden return, however apologetic, threatened to upend the careful balance she had established. In his study that evening, Alaric found himself facing a level of directness from his steward that surprised him, given Hargrove's usual formal reserve. "Your Grace, if I may speak plainly," Hargrove began, once the door was closed and they were alone. "The Duchess has endured a great deal since her arrival here, far more than any young woman should be asked to bear alone. The household has grown genuinely devoted to her, not out of any obligation, but because she has proven herself worthy of that devotion, through her own actions, time and again. I understand that, Hargrove. It is precisely why I have returned, to make amends for my previous neglect. With respect, Your Grace, understanding and amends are different matters entirely from actions sustained over time. The Duchess does not need grand apologies or single gestures of contrition. She needs consistency and genuine partnership, things she has not yet received from you in the months of your marriage." Alaric absorbed this criticism, delivered with unusual boldness from a servant who had every reason to maintain careful deference toward his employer. But he recognized, too, the truth underlying Hargrove's words, and found himself respecting the steward's willingness to speak honestly on his wife's behalf. "You are protective of her," Alaric observed. "We all are, Your Grace. The entire household. She earned that protection through her own character, and I would be remiss in my duties if I did not make clear that any further neglect on your part would not be received well by anyone here, myself included." The warning, delivered with quiet but unmistakable firmness, settled the matter clearly in Alaric's mind. Whatever authority he held as Duke over the estate and its affairs, he had lost, through his own neglect, the automatic deference and loyalty that might once have been assumed simply by virtue of his title. He would need to earn back trust here, just as his wife had earned genuine loyalty through months of consistent, caring action. "I intend to remain at Blackmore for the foreseeable future," Alaric said finally, "not simply to manage estate business, but to genuinely understand what my wife has built here, and to become, if possible, someone worthy of the partnership you describe." Hargrove studied him for a long moment before nodding, though his expression remained cautiously reserved rather than fully convinced. "I hope, for the Duchess's sake, and for the sake of this household, that your intentions prove sincere and lasting, Your Grace." Over the following days, Alaric found himself navigating an unfamiliar landscape at Blackmore, one where his title carried little automatic weight among a household that had learned to trust action over words. He attempted, initially, to simply resume management of the estate's affairs, as though his months of absence had never occurred, only to find Hargrove and the other staff deferring instead to Alara's established judgment on nearly every matter. "The Duchess prefers we handle the grain storage this way, Your Grace," Tobias explained politely but firmly, when Alaric suggested a different approach to preparing the orchard for the coming spring. "It's worked well for us this past season." "The household accounts are managed according to the Duchess's system now, Your Grace," Margaret said, when Alaric asked to review the ledgers himself. "Perhaps you might discuss any changes with her directly, since she is the one most familiar with the current arrangements." The pattern repeated itself throughout his first week back at Blackmore, a gentle but persistent redirection of authority back toward his wife, delivered by staff members, who clearly respected her judgment far more than any residual respect they held for his ducal title. Alaric found himself, for the first time in his life, genuinely humbled by the realization that authority, earned through consistent care and genuine partnership, carried far more weight, at least within these walls, than authority claimed simply through birthright and title. He began, gradually, to observe rather than direct, watching his wife move through her established routines with quiet competence and genuine warmth toward the staff who worked alongside her. He watched her patiently help Lucy with her reading lessons in the evenings, watched her discuss orchard management with Tobias with genuine knowledge and interest, watched her review household accounts with Margaret with the kind of careful attention he had never once bothered to apply to his own affairs. He also began to notice the small ways the household had organized itself around protecting her, subtle habits that revealed just how deeply her well-being had become woven into the fabric of daily life at Blackmore. Margaret ensured she ate properly, even on days when her health seemed uncertain. Tobias adjusted his outdoor work schedule to walk alongside her during her afternoon strolls through the orchard, offering quiet support without ever making the assistants feel like pity. Even Bridget, the young kitchen maid Alara had nursed back to health months earlier, seemed to watch over her with a protective attentiveness that spoke to genuine affection rather than mere professional duty. It was during one such afternoon, watching his wife walk slowly through the orchard paths, with Tobias hovering nearby in quiet support, that Alaric fully understood the extent of what he had missed by abandoning her to this estate months earlier. She had needed care and support during her illness, support he had never once considered providing himself, and in his absence, an entire household had stepped forward to offer exactly what he had failed to provide. That evening, he approached Alara in the small sitting room where she typically spent her evenings, finding her engaged in quiet reading by the fire, much as she had been on countless evenings before his return. "May I join you?" he asked, uncertain of his welcome. Alara looked up from her book, studying him for a moment, before nodding toward the chair opposite her own. "Of course." He settled into the chair, unsure how to begin the conversation that had been building in his mind throughout the day's observations. I have been watching how this household cares for you, he said finally. How genuinely they have come to love you, in ways I never once considered providing myself. They have given me more than I ever expected to find in this marriage, Ilara said quietly, setting her book aside. I will not pretend otherwise, Alaric. This household has become my family, in ways that matter deeply to me. I understand that now, and I recognize, watching them care for you so genuinely, exactly how much I failed you from the very beginning of our marriage. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. I do not ask you to forget that failure, or to pretend it did not happen, but I would like, if you are willing, the opportunity to earn something similar to what they have already given you freely. Ilara studied him carefully in the firelight, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Actions matter more than words, Alaric. If you are genuinely willing to earn trust here, I will not stand in your way. But I will not simply hand you what this household has spent months helping me build. That trust must be earned, the same way I earned theirs. I understand, Alaric said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he genuinely meant it. I am prepared to earn it, however long that might take. Ilara nodded slowly, something in her expression softening just slightly, though whether from genuine hope or simple acknowledgement of his sincerity, Alaric could not yet be certain. Then we shall see, in time, whether your words prove true. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted subtly between them, a small but genuine opening toward the possibility of something better than the cold formality that had defined their marriage since its very beginning. Winter began to loosen its grip on Blackmore as the weeks passed, the snow slowly retreating to reveal the first green shoots of early spring, pushing through the orchard's dark soil. With the changing season came a gradual shift in the household's dynamic as well, as Alaric settled into a routine that involved, for the first time in his life, genuine effort toward understanding the people and property that made up his estate. He began by simply observing, spending mornings alongside Tobias in the orchard, learning the practical work of tending trees and preparing fields for the coming growing season. He found the labor unexpectedly satisfying, a physical engagement with his own land that felt entirely different from the abstract management of distant properties he had grown accustomed to as Duke. "You've a decent hand for this, Your Grace," Tobias remarked one morning, watching Alaric attempt to properly prune a young apple tree under his careful instruction. "Better than I expected, if I'm honest." "I confess, I never bothered learning such things before," Alaric admitted. "My father believed a duke's time was better spent on matters of finance and politics, not manual labor." "Perhaps," Tobias said thoughtfully, continuing his own work on a neighboring tree. "But there's something to be said for understanding the land with your own hands, rather than just through numbers on a page." The Duchess understood that from her first days here, said she'd rather know the soil herself than simply be told about it by someone else. Alaric found himself, more and more, drawn to these small comparisons between his own developing understanding and his wife's already established competence, comparisons that consistently highlighted just how much ground he had to cover before he might genuinely earn the kind of respect she had built so thoroughly throughout the household. He began attending the household's shared meals in the kitchen, rather than insisting on formal dining in the empty grandeur of the main dining room. The transition was awkward at first, the staff clearly uncertain how to behave with their employer present at what had become, in his absence, a genuinely warm and familial gathering. But gradually, as he made clear through consistent presence and genuine humility that he intended no disruption to their established comfort, the atmosphere began to relax, if not entirely toward its previous warmth, then at least toward something more genuine than the stiff formality of his first days back. It was Bridget, surprisingly, who first extended something resembling genuine warmth toward him, several weeks into his return. "You know, Your Grace," she said one evening, setting down a plate of food with more ease than her earlier careful formality had suggested. "The Duchess speaks of you sometimes, when she thinks no one's listening closely enough to notice. Not with anger, mind you, though I'd not blame her if she felt some. More with a kind of hoping, I suppose." "Hoping for what, exactly?" Bridget considered the question carefully before answering. "That you might become someone worth the effort she's putting into giving you this second chance, Your Grace. She's not one to hold on to grudges without reason, but she's also not one to hand out trust without cause. If she's willing to watch and wait, That says something about what she believes you might yet become. The observation lingered with Alaric long after Bridget had returned to her kitchen duties, offering him a small but genuine measure of hope regarding his wife's true feelings beneath her carefully maintained professional distance. He continued his efforts throughout the following weeks, learning the household's rhythms and needs, contributing genuinely to the estate's management rather than simply asserting authority he had not yet earned. He worked alongside Hargrove to review the estate's finances, learning firsthand the extent of the theft Ilara had uncovered, and the careful, methodical work she had done to recover what could be recovered. He spent evenings in the library, reading through his own mother's old correspondence with the estate's various staff members, discovering a history of genuine care and connection he had never bothered to explore during his years of self-imposed distance. It was during one such evening, deep in his mother's old letters, that Ilara found him, having come to the library, seeking a book she had been meaning to finish. "I did not expect to find you here," she said, pausing in the doorway. "I have been reading my mother's correspondence," Alaric explained, gesturing toward the scattered letters across the desk before him. "I find I understand this house, and perhaps myself, better through her words than I ever managed on my own." Ilara approached slowly, curiosity evident in her expression, as she glanced at the letters spread before him. "Margaret has told me a little of your mother. She sounds as though she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Alaric said quietly. "I did not fully appreciate that until after she was gone, and by then, it felt too late to properly honor what she had tried to teach me." He paused, gathering courage before continuing. "She believed genuine strength came from connection, rather than distance. I spent years after her passing believing the opposite, that distance protected me from the pain of further loss. I understand now how wrong I was, and how much that belief cost both of us in the early months of our marriage." Ilara settled into the chair across from him, her expression softening slightly, as she listened to his admission. "Grief changes people, Alaric. I do not excuse what happened, but I understand, perhaps better than most, how illness and loss can shape a person's fears in ways that are difficult to overcome alone. You have overcome more than most, given everything you have faced," Alaric said, meeting her gaze directly. "Your own illness, the abandonment I inflicted upon you, the schemes of men like Colt seeking to exploit your circumstances. You met every challenge with a strength I have only begun to understand since my return here. I did not overcome these things alone, Alaric. This household gave me strength I did not know I possessed, through their genuine care and support. I learned, here at Blackmore, that I was worth more than the frail, forgettable bride you left on these steps months ago. That lesson came from them, not from myself alone. I am grateful to them for that lesson, even as I regret that I was not the one to teach it to you myself, as your husband should have done from the beginning." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken eventually by Ilara's quiet question. "What will you do now, Alaric? Now that you understand what you missed, what will you choose to become going forward?" Alaric considered the question seriously before answering. "I intend to remain at Blackmore, genuinely engaged in its management and in the well-being of everyone who calls it home, including you. I do not ask for immediate forgiveness or trust, only the continued opportunity to demonstrate, through sustained action, that I am capable of becoming someone worthy of the partnership this marriage should have always represented." Ilara studied him for a long moment, something shifting subtly in her expression, as she seemed to weigh the sincerity of his words against months of accumulated hurt and disappointment. "I appreciate your honesty, Alaric, and I will admit, watching your efforts these past weeks, that I have begun to believe you might genuinely mean what you say. But trust, once broken, does not rebuild itself quickly. I ask only that you understand and accept that reality, rather than expecting swift resolution to everything that happened between us." "I understand completely," Alaric said, "and I am prepared to wait however long is necessary, working each day to prove myself worthy of whatever trust you might eventually be willing to extend." As spring continued its gradual arrival at Blackmore, bringing new growth to the orchard and renewed warmth to the estate's ancient stone walls, something similarly gradual began taking root between husband and wife. A slow, careful rebuilding of connection, built not on grand gestures or empty promises, but on the patient, consistent work of genuine partnership finally being attempted for the first time since their wedding day. Spring brought with it an unexpected challenge that tested everything Alaric had been working to build since his return to Blackmore. A letter arrived from the capital, forwarded through Nathaniel Cross, informing him that Edmund Colt, despite his earlier retreat, had filed a formal legal claim, asserting that the Duke's continued residence at Blackmore, combined with his previous absence, constituted grounds for questioning the validity of certain estate management decisions made during his months away. "This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to salvage something from his failed schemes," Hargrove said, reading through the legal document with visible frustration. "He has no genuine grounds for such a claim." "Perhaps not," Alaric replied, though his expression remained troubled. "But legal proceedings, even baseless ones, can drag on for months, creating exactly the kind of uncertainty and distraction Colt likely hopes will benefit him in the end." Alara, who had joined the conversation upon hearing raised voices from the study, read through the document herself, with the same careful attention she had applied to the estate's ledgers months earlier. "He is claiming that decisions I made during your absence, Alaric, particularly regarding the recovery proceedings against Fenwick, lack proper legal standing, because I acted without your direct authorization at the time. An absurd claim, given that Cross's own correspondence confirms my full support for your actions," Alaric said firmly. "Absurd, yes, but not without potential complications," Alara said thoughtfully. "If Colt can create enough legal uncertainty around the timing of your authorization, he might delay the recovery proceedings long enough to attempt some other scheme, or simply to cause enough disruption that the estate suffers regardless of the eventual outcome." The three of them spent the following days working closely together to prepare a proper legal response, drawing on every piece of documentation available to demonstrate the clear legitimacy of Alara's actions throughout the estate's crisis. Alaric found himself, throughout this process, genuinely impressed by his wife's methodical approach to the challenge, her ability to anticipate potential complications and prepare thorough countermeasures with a precision that matched or exceeded his own legal advisor's expertise. "You have a genuine talent for this kind of work," he observed one evening, as they reviewed documents together in the study, the fire casting warm light across the scattered papers between them. "I had considerable time to develop such talents, given the circumstances of my arrival here," Alara replied, though there was less sharpness in her tone than such a comment might once have carried. "Necessity teaches quickly, when there is no one else to rely upon." "I regret that necessity, even as I admire what it produced," Alaric said quietly, "though I recognize such regret does little to undo the months you spent facing these challenges without proper support." Alara paused in her work, studying him thoughtfully across the desk. "You have said similar things many times since your return, Alaric. I believe you, more each day, though I confess, I still find myself uncertain how fully to trust that belief with my own heart, rather than simply my mind." "I understand that uncertainty," Alaric said. "I do not ask you to resolve it before you are genuinely ready. I only ask that you allow me to continue demonstrating, through action, that I am worthy of eventually earning that fuller trust." Their work against Colt's legal claim continued over the following weeks, eventually culminating in a formal hearing before the local magistrate, where the overwhelming documentation Alara and Alaric had prepared together left little room for Colt's claims to gain any genuine traction. The magistrate dismissed the case within a single afternoon, citing the clear and thorough evidence of proper authorization and legitimate estate management throughout the entire period in question. Colt, humiliated by the swift dismissal and facing mounting legal costs of his own, did not attempt any further interference in Blackmore's affairs, disappearing entirely from the region within days of the hearing's conclusion. The victory brought a quiet sense of relief throughout the household, celebrated with a modest gathering in the kitchen that evening, staff and Duke and Duchess alike sharing a meal together, with genuine warmth that had, gradually, become the household's new normal rather than a rare exception. It was during this gathering that Margaret, emboldened perhaps by the evening's celebratory mood, addressed Alaric directly, with an observation that captured what many in the household had likely been thinking throughout the recent months. "You've changed a great deal since your return, Your Grace," she said, setting down a fresh pot of tea. "I'll admit, when you first arrived back at Blackmore, none of us quite knew what to make of it, or whether your intentions would prove genuine. But watching you these past months, working alongside the Duchess and the rest of us rather than simply asserting authority from above, I believe you've earned something real here, not just from her, but from all of us." Alaric felt a genuine warmth at Margaret's words, recognizing in them an acknowledgement of exactly the kind of transformation he had been working toward since his return. "Thank you, Margaret. That means more to me than you likely realize, given everything I failed to provide this household during my earlier absence." "We all make mistakes, Your Grace," Margaret said simply. "What matters more is what we choose to do once we recognize them. You've chosen well these past months." The evening continued, with the kind of easy warmth that had become increasingly common throughout the household since Alaric's genuine efforts began bearing fruit. Laughter and quiet conversation filling the kitchen in a way that would have seemed impossible during those first tense days following his unexpected return. Later that night, walking together through the quiet halls toward their separate bedrooms, Alaric and Alara paused near the window overlooking the orchard, now fully in bloom with the first blossoms of spring. "I have been thinking," Alara said quietly, watching the moonlight filter through the flowering branches outside, "about everything that has happened since I first arrived at these steps, frightened and uncertain of what awaited me here." "And what conclusions have you reached?" Alaric asked, watching her carefully in the dim light. "That perhaps abandonment, however painful, sometimes creates space for genuine transformation that might never have occurred otherwise. I do not say this to excuse what you did, Alaric, only to acknowledge that I have become someone stronger and more genuinely myself through the challenges these months presented." "And what of us, going forward?" Alaric asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to express. "What do you believe our marriage might yet become, given everything we have both learned?" Alara turned to face him fully, her expression thoughtful in the soft moonlight. "I believe, Alaric, that we are only beginning to discover what genuine partnership might look like between us. I am not yet ready to say my trust has fully returned, but I find myself, more each day, willing to continue this journey alongside you, curious, rather than fearful about what we might yet build together." It was, Alaric recognized, perhaps the most hopeful thing she had said to him since his return, a genuine opening toward possibility, rather than mere professional tolerance of his continued presence. He did not push for more than she offered, understanding instinctively that genuine trust could not be rushed or demanded, only earned through continued patience and consistent care. "Then I am grateful for whatever journey we continue together," he said simply, "however long it takes to fully rebuild what should have been present between us from the very beginning." They stood together at the window a while longer, watching moonlight dance across the blooming orchard below. Two people slowly rediscovering the possibility of genuine connection, after months of hardship and hard-won growth, had finally brought them to this quiet, hopeful moment. A full year passed since the cold morning Alara Whitfield had first stood alone on Blackmore's steps, watching her husband's carriage disappear into the fog. The estate that had once seemed forgotten and neglected now flourished under the combined care of a household that had learned, through hardship and patience, to build something genuine out of what had begun as abandonment. Alara stood once more at the same steps where her journey had begun, though the woman who stood there now bore little resemblance to the frail, frightened bride of a year earlier. Her health remained delicate, a permanent part of who she was, but she had learned to work within its limits, rather than be defined entirely by them, finding strength in purpose and genuine community that no illness could fully diminish. Beside her stood Alaric, no longer the cold, distant duke, who had once dismissed her as merely an obligation to be managed from a distance. The months since his return had transformed him, as thoroughly as her own months of independence had transformed her, each of them growing into people genuinely capable of the partnership their marriage had originally promised, but failed to deliver. The household gathered around them for a small celebration marking the anniversary of Alara's arrival, a tradition Margaret had proposed months earlier, insisting that the day deserved recognition not as a memorial to abandonment, but as a celebration of everything that had grown from those difficult early days. "To think," Hargrove said, raising a glass of wine as the household gathered in the great hall, now fully restored to something resembling its former grandeur, "that a year ago we welcomed a stranger to these steps, uncertain what to expect from a duchess we knew only through unkind rumors and unfair assumptions. And now," Bridget continued, raising her own glass with a warm smile toward Alara, "we could not imagine this household without her steady hand and genuine heart, guiding us through every challenge that has come our way." Alara felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the genuine affection surrounding her, so different from the cold formality that had characterized her earlier life before Blackmore became her true home. "I could say the same of each of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me purpose and belonging when I had neither, and taught me, through your own examples, what genuine strength and loyalty truly mean." Tobias, never one for lengthy speeches, simply raised his own glass with a quiet nod of respect, to the Duchess and to whatever comes next for this household. The celebration continued late into the evening, filled with the kind of warmth and laughter that had become Blackmore's new normal, rather than a rare exception. Staff and Duke and Duchess alike sharing genuine community, built through months of shared hardship and hard-won growth. Later, as the celebration wound down and staff began retiring for the evening, Alaric found a quiet moment alone with Alara in the estate's small chapel, its repaired roof now standing as a symbol of everything they had rebuilt together over the past year. "A year ago," he said quietly, standing beside her in the peaceful stone building, "I could not have imagined we would arrive at this moment, together, genuinely grateful for the journey that brought us here." "Nor could I," Alara admitted. "I remember standing on these steps, believing myself abandoned and forgotten, uncertain whether I possessed the strength to survive what awaited me here, let alone build something meaningful out of such difficult beginnings." "You possessed more strength than either of us realized," Alaric said, taking her hand gently in his own, a gesture that had become increasingly natural between them over the recent months. "And that strength transformed not only your own life, but mine as well, and the lives of everyone who calls this household home." Alara studied him carefully in the soft evening light filtering through the chapel's restored windows. "Do you regret it, Alaric? The abandonment that ultimately led us here, despite everything painful about those early months?" Alaric considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the pain I caused you, deeply and completely. But I cannot regret entirely the path that led us to this moment, watching you become someone so genuinely remarkable, someone I have come to love, not out of obligation, but through genuine admiration, for everything you have shown yourself capable of becoming." The word love, spoken quietly but with unmistakable sincerity, settled meaningfully between them in the chapel's peaceful silence. Alara felt her own heart respond with a warmth she had not expected to feel so fully, a genuine affection that had grown steadily throughout the months of Alaric's consistent, patient effort to earn back the trust his earlier neglect had shattered. "I find myself, Alaric, feeling something similar," she admitted quietly, "though I confess, it surprises me, given everything that happened between us initially." "Love often surprises us most when we least expect to find it," Alaric said softly, "particularly when it grows not from grand gestures, but from patient, consistent care, sustained over genuine time." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, two people who had traveled a difficult but ultimately transformative journey from cold obligation toward genuine partnership, their marriage finally becoming something neither had expected when they first exchanged formal vows a year earlier. As they eventually made their way back toward the main house, walking together through the moonlit orchard that had witnessed so much of their shared growth over the past year, Alara reflected on everything that had brought her to this moment. She thought of the frightened, frail bride who had once stood weeping on Blackmore's cold steps, uncertain whether she possessed the strength to survive her husband's abandonment, let alone build something meaningful from such painful beginnings. That woman had transformed, through hardship and genuine community, into someone capable of uncovering theft, defending against schemes, earning fierce loyalty, and ultimately, rebuilding a marriage that had once seemed entirely hollow into something genuinely worth treasuring. The household that had chosen her so completely during those difficult early months remained by her side still, no longer simply protecting her from an absent husband, but celebrating alongside both husband and wife as they continued building a genuine future together, rooted in the hard-won trust and mutual respect that had grown from Blackmore's forgotten soil into something beautiful and lasting. As they reached the main house, its windows glowing warmly with candlelight against the darkening evening sky, Alara paused for a moment, taking in the full picture of everything she had built during her year at Blackmore. The estate that had once seemed forgotten and neglected now stood as a testament to genuine transformation, Proof that even the deepest abandonment could become, with enough patience and genuine care, the foundation for something far stronger than what had existed before. She turned to Alaric, offering him a genuine smile that held none of the cautious reserve that had characterized their early interactions following his return. "Shall we go inside? I believe our house awaits us, and I find myself genuinely eager to continue whatever comes next for all of us together." Alaric returned her smile, taking her hand once more, as they walked together toward the warmly lit entrance of the home that had become, through hardship and genuine growth, truly theirs to share. "Together," he agreed softly. "Exactly as it always should have been, from the very beginning." Behind them, the orchard continued its quiet blooming beneath the gentle spring moonlight, bearing witness to a transformation that had turned abandonment into strength, neglect into genuine partnership, and a forgotten estate into a true and lasting home.